Welcome to the College Admissions Process Podcast presented by Prep Expert. Prep Expert offers live online SAT and ACT courses with the best score guarantees, instructors, and curriculum. Go to prepexpert.com to guarantee your child's success. I'm also excited to share my book, Straight from the Admissions Office, a review of my biggest takeaways from the first few hundred podcast episodes. It's packed with direct insights from admissions professionals and practical tips to help students and their families navigate the college admissions process. You can find all of the information in the show notes. Welcome to The Cap, where we are here to speak with college reps and other professionals in the field of college admissions to help answer all your questions and guide you through every step of the process. So if you're serious about college admissions, you've come to the right place. Are you ready? Let's talk about it. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Durante. Welcome to The Cap, the College Admissions Process Podcast. I am your host, John Durante, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today Tosca, who's a current student at Deep Springs College. Now, Tosca is the chair of the Communications Committee, and we also have Walker, who's also a current student. Walker is a member of the Applications Committee. Welcome, Tosca and Walker. How are you?
Thanks, John. It's great to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Doing well.
Fantastic. So glad to have you. Not only are you so involved with your college, but you're also current students, which is a nice spin in terms of the podcast. Another spin is that Deep Springs College is really so unique compared to so many other colleges and universities. So it's often described, Tosca, as one of the most unique colleges, frankly, in the world. For those unfamiliar, can you give an overview of what makes Deep Springs College so distinctive in terms of its size, location, and your mission?
Yeah, so Deep Springs has a lot of unique elements. Sort of one of the biggest ones is the size of the school. So we only admit between 13 and 15 students every year. Deep Springs is a 2-year program, so that means the student body usually hovers between 25 and 30 students. It's located on a cattle ranch in California, in the desert, sort of above Death Valley. It's near a town called Bishop. So those are two big things, size and location. Another really big part of the program is what is called the 3 pillars. One of those is labor, another is self-governance, and the third is academics. So that sort of structures the program. Students do labor, they take classes, and they also engage in student self-governance of the college, which we'll probably talk more about later. And then there are 3 or 4 more important elements. One of them is that we offer a full ride scholarship to everybody who's admitted. Deep Springs, when it was founded in 1917, the free aspect was a really big part of our founder's mission. He wanted people to come here and take ownership over the education and not have to pay for that reason. So everybody goes for free. And then another big thing is that students who go here are expected to dedicate themselves to living a life of service and leadership to humanity. So it's a big phrase. Everybody's always trying to figure out what exactly that means, but that's sort of the trade-off. You get a free education and then you're supposed to do something really big and quite impactful with it. And then the last sort of big aspect of the college are what are called the ground rules. So one of those is our isolation policy, which is that students don't leave campus during term. We don't typically allow visitors in, though that sometimes changes depending on the circumstances. And also students abstain from drug and alcohol use, and that is enforced by the student body. So, it's adhered to pretty rigorously. I'm trying to think. Those are kind of all of the big ones. There's so many to go over. And I guess historically, Deep Springs was all male for 100 years and only recently went co-ed 6 years ago. So, yeah.
Well, that's an awesome overview. You gave us so much. For example, first of all, every student that is accepted gets a full ride, which is obviously so unique, but there's only 13 to 15 students that are admitted each year. Your total population is 25 to 30 students, and you're on a cattle ranch in beautiful California. I love how you talked about the 3 pillars, which I'm sure we'll unpackage a little bit more. You mentioned the labor, self-governance, and academics as part of those three pillars. And I'm also curious, Tosca, how does Deep Spring's focus on academics, labor, and self-governance shape the student experience? And how do these elements work together to create a holistic education?
Yeah, well, I think any Deep Springs student will tell you that the three pillars sort of work seamlessly with each other, or while you're living and working here, you come to understand how they're related in a very intimate way. And that's often something that we ask our applicants to talk quite a lot about, like how they think that, labor and academics might be connected. For me, I think the connections between academics and self governance feel very strong and immediate. Your academic journey here is very self motivated in some ways, or it's motivated by the desires and political impulses and constraints of the student body. And so, one of the things that Deep Springs tries to teach students is to take real ownership over their education. And one way that we do that is by giving students control over things like classes, like what classes are being taught and what teachers are being hired. So that's a very sort of direct link between academics and self governance. Labor is sort of also connected to that through the idea of ownership. The kinds of labor that we do here is very intimately connected to our everyday life. Obviously, students work on the ranch. Like Walker and I are both part of what's called the cowboy program, which we might end up talking about later. But a lot of the labor that students do is, has to do with cooking, cleaning, sort of daily things to run the college. And so that labor is really about allowing students to feel this sense of ownership over their community and over their everyday lives. You have to work here, and if you're cooking and somebody forgets to cook, then this is a very obvious example we always talk about, but then nobody eats. And so there's this immediate connection between self-governance and the value of having responsibility for your community and laboring for it. Those things are connected. The Deep Springs academic pillar is very rigorous. The main focus is the humanities. I would say right now, that sort of has changed throughout Deep Springs history. There's a strong focus on the humanities. There's also strong focus on the natural sciences. Deep Springers often take very small classes because there's so few of us. So a small class at Deep Springs could mean 4 or 5 people, and enrollment caps at 9 for most classes. The student body votes on what classes we end up taking. Professors will propose courses, and then the student body deliberates and votes on what courses. The classes are often run as seminars. There's usually pretty heavy reading loads. The reading is sort of the main focus of the class, and then students will have a discussion that is led by the teacher in sort of typically a pretty hands-off way. This is another area where students are expected to take responsibility for the quality of the discussion, for how much students are getting out of the class. So you see a lot of aspects of self-governance also in academics. Students might, for example, like vote on when assignments are going to be due, or they write each other evaluations and have discussions about ways to improve the class if things aren't going as might be expected. So you kind of see all three pillars interact with each other in this very interesting way. I think they each have their own benefits, and they're mutually entangled in such a way that Deep Springs, I think, couldn't operate without any of if we missed one, it wouldn't really be Deep Springs. They're all three sort of are necessary. So
Well, that's terrific. Thank you so much. You broke down the three pillars beautifully. In terms of self-governance, students have direct input in terms of the classes being taught and the teachers being hired. In terms of labor, you talked about how you and Walker are part of the Cowboy program, which includes daily labor to run the college. But this is, of course, includes cooking and cleaning and things like that. And in terms of the academics, you talked about how there's a strong focus on the humanities and the natural sciences, all under the umbrella, by the way, of really giving all of the students a sense of real ownership at the college. So, Walker, let's turn to you. Welcome again. The college offers full financial aid to all admitted students, as we mentioned earlier. Can you explain the process for determining financial aid packages and what makes Deep Spring's funding model unique compared to all other institutions?
Yeah, so I think the first real differentiating factor is what we mean when we say financial aid. Deep Springs doesn't charge any students any tuition, no charge for room and board, nothing of the sort. And this is automatic. There's no process of financial aid. This is automatic. Deep Springs charges no student a dime. So when we talk about financial aid, we're talking about helping students afford sort of auxiliary costs. So this is things like we can help book your flights to school if this is going to be a burden for you and your family. We can buy your books. We can buy outdoor supplies if you need a warm jacket or something like this. And Deep Springs will cover all this. So when we talk about financial aid, these are the sort of things we're talking about. But the process actually of not having to pay tuition, this is automatic, and there's no qualification for that whatsoever. And so when we do look at qualification for financial aid, it tends to be a very holistic, inclusive process. It's fairly private between you and our office manager, figuring out what's feasible for you and your family. And because Deep Springs is such a small, sort of tight-knit community, there is a formal financial aid process, but there's also a culture of sort of taking care of people as needed. So if it's going to be a burden to buy books or something of the sort, I can't imagine a situation in which we wouldn't help, regardless of sort of the process of financial aid. And I think this is really what sets Deep Springs apart in terms of that financial aid aspect, is it's very human because we know you so well and we're so intimately connected with you. And there's no expectation that you'd have to pay for any sort of tuition, room board, these sorts of things that we've talked about. And it's really more about our financial aid program is really more about making sure you have access to everything you need to make the most of the experience.
I love how you talked about the culture of taking care of people and, frankly, being human. That's amazing. And the fact that there's really no financial aid process is really refreshing, right? Because colleges and universities throughout the country and beyond are just so expensive. So the idea that if you get admitted, it's absolutely free is just phenomenal. So thank you for that overview. And Walker, Deep Springs has a highly selective admissions process. There's only about 13 to 15 students who are admitted each year. So, can you walk us through what you look for in applicants and how the review process differs from traditional colleges?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Before I answer it, I just want to make clear we do have a formal financial aid process. It's just that what we're looking for in financial aid is different than most normal schools. So the questions we're asking for financial aid are not how much can we afford to make you pay, it's what do you need help with, which I think is a fundamentally different question. But there is a formal process and these sorts of things. But no student pays tuition. You're right that there's no formal process around that. In terms of what we look for in admissions, it is a highly competitive admissions process. I think this year we're on track to accept around 2% of applicants. And so what we're really looking for, I can break it down into four general categories. The first is we call it something sort of like intellectual vitality, where we're really looking for students who have something original to say, who are deeply invested in the ideas and the things they're talking about, and are able to communicate that effectively. The second is sort of like, are you academically qualified? Do we think you have the academic preparation to do well here? And that can mean a variety of things. We know students are coming from all sorts of different schools, so we do try to take a pretty general view of what it means to be qualified to do well here as a student. But it does matter that you are able to do well here as a student. The next is something sort of like work ethic or long-term commitments. So we might here look at what kind of things are you involved with outside of your classes. But there's no real specific criteria. We try to keep all our criteria pretty general so that we capture the value of any student. But this is things like, do you have long-term commitments? Are you doing things that matter to you outside of classes? Do you seem like you have a lot to offer? And Deep Springs is a very rigorous place. It's very intense. So also, do we think you're going to be able to keep up with that and be able to make the most out of it? And then the last is something sort of like your enthusiasm for the program, your compatibility with it. And this is really just to say that Deep Springs is a very particular program. It's wonderful for the people it fits for, but it doesn't fit for everyone. And so we really try to find people who we think are going to want what Deep Springs has to offer, because Deep Springs has something pretty remarkable to offer, but it's not for everyone. And we're very cognizant of that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I have a lot of follow ups. First of all, you talked about the financial aid process. I was just curious, is there a FAFSA form that has to actually be filled out, or do you do something completely different?
So right now we do something completely different. It's pretty general information and it's mostly self-reported. Not all, but mostly self-reported in terms of financial means. We are looking at getting on the FAFSA, so that might change soon. But I will say if we do get on the FAFSA, it wouldn't change our fundamental financial aid process. We still wouldn't charge tuition. We would still try to keep the same mindset, but it would be more about trying to connect students with the maximum amount of resources because they could potentially get a lot of federal money if we got on the FAFSA. And for students for whom that makes a difference, we're really excited about that possibility.
Understood. And Walker, your admissions process includes things like essays, interviews, and of course, those recommendations. What advice would you give to students applying to Deep Springs to ensure they stand out? And what can you tell us in terms of what you're looking for from these parts of the overall application?
Yeah, I would say the pitfall most students they sort of fall into these habits, which I have to think are forced upon them, or they sort of think we want, where they talk about they fall into cliches. They talk about how all they really want is a rigorous academic program. They talk about that Deep Spring speaks to them, blah 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 blah. And it's not that these sort of cliches are necessarily wrong, but we're much less interested in figuring out that you can anticipate what we want to hear and tell us what we want to hear. We'd much rather you say something that you really believe and care about. And this can be, I mean, some of my favorite applications have been quite critical of Deep Springs in their application, or they've said, like, these are questions that I would really want to have answered if I were to come to Deep Springs. And these sorts of things where you can show us that you're really thinking on your own terms and that you really have things that you care about and that matter to you. And this is what you would bring to Deep Springs. This is what by far excites us the most. And the other thing I'll just say is that when we say we interview applicants, there's actually a whole second round to the application. So there's a first round to the application, which has things like grades, essays, these sorts of things, and then we take a cut from the first round and select them for the second round of the application. And if you're invited to complete the second round of the application, we'll have some more essays. That's when we accept letters of rec. These sorts of things. But also, and the biggest part of the second round is that you visit. So you'll come to campus, you'll try out labor, you'll sit in on classes. We do have an interview. You'll come to student body meetings. So you'll really get to know the people in the community and we'll really get to know you. And I think this second round is essential for what we're able to do in our applications process. Because first of all, it gives you a really good sense of what you're signing up for. And so hopefully by the time you decide to come to Deep Springs, you're very, very committed to it. But also it means we can take a really broad view of who you are as a person and what you offer to the community because we've spent a week getting to know you. We spent a week laboring with you. We've seen what you're able to talk about, what you care about, what excites you, what you might struggle with. And this is what really allows us to take a really, I think, thorough view of what every person has to offer and how they would fit into our community.
Well, I appreciate that. And I was just curious because you mentioned round two of the application process. Is there ever a point where, in order to be admitted to a round, you have to basically state that if accepted, you're going to attend? In other words, is there ever a binding portion of the application review process?
That's a good question. No, we never have a binding portion of the application process. We do say we offer you a spot in the second round. You can decline. After your visit, we almost always email and say, are you still interested? We understand you've been through a very tense experience with the process, blah, 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 and we'd like to make sure you're still interested. And at that point, students can say yes or no. They generally tend to say yes. Uh, and then we go from there, but there's never a binding agreement.
Well, I appreciate that. And how does Deep Springs view standardized test scores, and what role do they play, if any, in your holistic application review process?
Yeah, this is something we've been talking about recently, and I know it's something that most colleges have been talking about recently. So we do accept test scores, but they are optional and have been for quite a while. Our view of standardized test scores is that they can be a uniquely helpful tool in seeing that a student is academically qualified to come to Deep Springs. And what I mean by that is if you're a student who's gone to the right boarding schools or these sorts of things, we don't have to worry about that because we know that if you have good grades, they are sort of substantiated by a rigorous academic program. And that's not true of every school in the country. And so we try to do really thorough research about every high school, figure out what the profile of what classes are offered. So if you're not taking APs, is it because they weren't available? These sorts of things. We try to look really carefully into these sorts of things. But a test score can be a really helpful way to say, I might not have the best grades because of extenuating circumstances, or I might have gone to a school with really high grade inflation, but I am still a qualified student who has a lot to offer, and I want you to see that. And so this means we really also try to read the test scores in the context of the application. So if you're taking the SAT, if you're a student who had, horrible family circumstances, these sorts of things, but you have a 1450 on the SAT, this matters a lot more to us than a student who we know is already going to be qualified who has a 1600 on the SAT. And I would say that our view of test scores is that for a lot of applicants, they don't matter. If we know you're going to do well here, your test scores don't matter, even if you don't have very good test scores. But for the applicants who really need a way to show that they are a qualified student who could handle it, test scores can be a really helpful way, just so we can say to ourselves, look, we know this student had a lot going on. We know their grades aren't what they could be. We know their school didn't offer them the same kinds of opportunities. But because of this test score, we have faith that they would be able to if the circumstances were different.
Well, we definitely appreciate that overview. And I want to go back to Tosca. Tosca, Deep Springs offers only a 2-year program, after which most students transfer to other colleges. How do you prepare students for the transition, and what are some of the most common institutions they transfer to?
Thanks, John. So the Deep Springs transfer process can be a little bit difficult on our students for a number of reasons. The actual process of transferring is hard just because transfer admissions are sometimes more selective than first year admissions. Depends on the college. At some schools, that number is actually reversed. It's easier to get in through transfer than first year admissions, but at a lot of schools, it is more difficult. I think Deep Springers are generally well prepared to get into the schools that they want to go to because they've been through this intense academic program. Deep Springs, for one, teaches you to write really well. So I think a lot of students are able to write better essays when they're transferring out of Deep Springs than when they were doing first year admissions 2 years prior. And then also, they're able to get really great letters of recommendation because they worked so closely with the staff and faculty here. So I think those are ways that being at Deep Springs can be easier for transfer admissions. And also, of course, you're getting the support of our dean who helps with transfer admissions. And we have a lot of connections at other universities, students who go there. There are lots of Deep Springs alumni who are professors who can help talk with students. The difficulty of the process is both in the actual application and what happens when Deep Springers leave and actually go to those new schools. So it can be very difficult to complete your application while you're a student here just because you have so many things going on. You have so many other priorities, and it's very hard to suddenly shift your whole mentality and be completing a college application and suddenly be thinking about totally different things. So because of that, a lot of students opt to take a gap year between Deep Springs and their second institution. I'd say that's usually about a third of each class chooses to do that. And it's also just difficult because Deep Springers tend to apply to a lot of the same places. And so these schools often know Deep Springs and are very comfortable accepting 1 or 2 students every year, but they're really not going to accept more. So that often means that you're actually competing not with other transfer applicants, but with other Deep Springers in your class. So I think that is a sort of added layer of complication and difficulty. Yeah, these schools are often Ivies, but not just Ivies. Deep Springers, long ago in the past, in the 50s and 60s, pretty much exclusively transferred to Ivies, but of course that was a very different time for college admissions, as you probably know, and that is definitely not the case anymore. I'd say nowadays it looks more like maybe a third of a class. So if you have a class size of of 12 or something, you might have a third or a fourth of the class going to Ivies, maybe 3 or 4 students, and then you have a bulk of the class getting into what might be considered Ivy Plus schools or top level liberal arts colleges. Think like Williams or Bowdoin, Bates, places like that. And then, of course, some students try and go, especially if they're international students, they'll try and return to schools in their home country, but that can often be difficult because transfer admissions processes are more complicated in other schools and less common in other countries than in the US. So there's that. The sort of final aspect of it is that transfer adjustment process can be very difficult for Deep Springers. You're going from Deep Springs to a school that is so different, so much bigger, very different priorities. You're not laboring anymore. So a lot of Deep Springers will feel sort of, in cold water for the first, semester, 2 semesters, and it can be difficult to adjust. But that's why they often go places with other Deep Springers. So I guess the places the Deep Springers are at most frequently right now are Columbia. We have a number of students at Columbia. U Chicago is often very popular. Um, Bard Berlin. I'm trying to think the other. I would say those are sort of the top three schools that are very popular among Deep Springers.
Well, we definitely appreciate the insight. Thank you so much. And I was curious, Tosca, what is one common misconception about Deep Springs College that you'd like to address for prospective students and their families?
This is a great question because there's so many possible misconceptions. When I was thinking about this, I'm trying to pick my favorite one. I think a good one would be sort of the Deep Springs. I don't know how else to call this, but the Deep Springs quirkiness. Like a lot of the press coverage of Deep Springs focuses a lot on sort of the individuality of the students and this sort of eccentric, eclectic feeling of the school, and it focuses a lot on like they're riding horses and they're reading Plato at the same time, and they're so quirky. I don't know how else to describe it. That's really what people tend to focus on when they're covering the school. And so I think a lot of students, prospective applicants, will come here, especially for the second round visit, and really try to emphasize quirky or weird things about themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that in principle. Like you should emphasize what is individual and unique about you as a person in your application. But I think some students will emphasize more like superficial things at the cost of unique real interests or passions or ambitions. They'll kind of want to focus more on something about their weird taste in books, or I don't know how else to describe it, superficial things, instead of really showing AppCom a kind of earnestness. And I think that can often sort of stab them in the back because they are not sort of focusing on the right things. And I do think that has to do with the media coverage, which will so often focus on this one aspect of the school. So.
Well, I appreciate that. And we could definitely relate because in many of the podcast episodes, actually, the admissions representatives talk about the fact that you shouldn't focus students on what you think the admissions representatives want to hear. Right. So in this case, Tosca is talking about how you may think that they want to hear about any quirkiness, right, for lack of a better term, but perhaps it's more important to really just showcase who you are, right? And if Deep Springs is the right fit, fantastic. And if it's not, that's okay too, right? There's over 4,000 colleges and universities in the country. There's many schools that are the right fit for you, but not all schools are. So I think it's important to be true to yourself and just be honest throughout the process, and you'll surely end up where you belong. So I really appreciate that. Now, this has been an awesome conversation. Before we get to the last question, I always like to ask this next question, and we're going to start with you, Tosca, and Walker, be ready because we're going to come to you next. And my question is, are there any questions I didn't ask or a topic that I didn't bring up that you'd like to share with us now? Tosca?
Yeah, I think that, and I brought this up earlier, but the Deep Springs focus on what we call life of service is, I think, really important and sometimes underreported, under-focused on, especially in regards to the admissions process. I think that students who are interested in Deep Springs and interested in applying should really think about that directive that's been put out, that if you go here, it is really important to consider what it might mean to live a life of service, what life changes that might entail, what you really think that could look like. And if you're interested in spending a lot of time thinking about that question and talking about it with other people, I think, at least for me, that's a pretty important aspect of the application and important thing that applicants should be focused on in regards to Deep Spring specifically.
Well, I appreciate that. Walker, what do you have for us?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is really a question. The one thing I think is interesting to think about from the outside is how you see Deep Springs fitting into your education more generally. And some people, I think, I don't want to say make the mistake, but some people are very quick to think about Deep Springs as an alternative to higher education, which I think is very compelling. But I think they forget that this is only supposed to be 2 years and part of a much broader process of education. And that the idea is not to sort of run away into the wilderness, but to come out for 2 years and then return. And so I don't really know how to phrase that as a question, but I do think that's the one interesting thing to think about is how are you thinking about the way Deep Springs will fit into the rest of your life, because it won't be the rest of your life.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It won't be the rest of your life. And in addition, Walker, to reflecting on how Deep Springs is going to add to your own life, for lack of a better term, how important in the process is it for students to talk about how they intend to contribute if, in fact, they're lucky enough to come to Deep Springs? Is that something that is important in the overall application review?
It's definitely important for us to see or understand how you'll contribute, but this doesn't always have to take the form of saying, I would offer this explicitly.
Right.
It's very exciting to see an applicant, for example, I'm just going to make up a random example, but who's very into fixing bikes or something like this, or who's very into Aristotelian virtue ethics or something like this. It's very exciting to us when you know something very well and care about it a lot. And if you can tell us about that, just tell us about what you care about. You don't have to say, and I would contribute to Deep Springs in the following ways. I think we try to work a little harder to see for ourselves what you would offer, and we can take some of that burden on.
Well, that's awesome. And it goes back again to the point, be yourself, students. Showcase all the great things that you have to offer without trying to portray yourself in the light of what you think the admissions rep at Deep Springs wants to see. And again, if it's the right fit, fantastic. And if not, that's okay. No school is for everyone. Walker, Tosca, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Unfortunately, it does lead us to the last question. We're going to start with you first, Tosca, and then you, Walker. What is your top piece of advice that you would give a student thinking about applying to Deep Springs College?
Yeah, this is kind of a cop-out answer, but I think if you have the opportunity to, it's really good to talk to somebody who was a student at Deep Springs or maybe worked here as a staff or faculty member before or during your application process. Of course, not everybody has access to that, but you can just email the communications committee and we can put you in touch with somebody. I think it's really both helpful to you because you can write a better application and helpful to you to know whether or not Deep Springs is the right place for you to talk to somebody who's been here and knows the school really well. Especially because there's just so many particularities. It's such a specific program. It's really helpful to be able to talk to somebody who knows the school really well.
Well, thank you so much, Tosca. I really appreciate having you on the podcast. Walker, you're up.
My piece of advice, I guess, is less instrumental, but it's you really need to understand why you want to come to Deep Springs, because Deep Springs will be a very hard place. Even the people who love it the most will always or naturally have hard times here. And so I think you coming in should have a very solid understanding of what you want from the program, and that can be very personal, and that puts you in good stead, I think, for making it through. It also helps you stand out in the application process. But most importantly, I think it's very hard to do well at Deep Springs if you don't have some clear idea of why you came.
Well, that's terrific. You guys are both amazing. This has been a phenomenal conversation, and I'm really happy as I know it's going to help so many students and their parents as they consider Deep Springs College. I hope to have you guys again. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, thank you, John.
My pleasure, and to everyone out there, good luck with the college search. Take care all, and best wishes. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The CAP, the College Admissions Process Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please don't forget to tell a friend and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. I am your host, John Durante, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of The CAP. Thank you for listening to the College Admissions Process Podcast presented by Prep Expert. Prep Expert offers live online SAT and ACT courses with the best score guarantees, instructors, and curriculum. Go to prepexpert.com to guarantee your child's success.